I used to do a lot of whitewater rafting. I love taking people on the river. I love water. I love doing it. And for years, I'd take people on trips down rivers and whitewater rafts, and I had a great time. I had a friend who was a good bit better at this than I was, and he convinced me at some point that we ought to try going down the river together in a canoe, and that he had done it a bunch and it wouldn't be that big a deal. So when he first started talking to me about it, it sounded like a lot of work. But if you haven't done rafting or been around the rivers very much, there's sort of a hierarchy when it comes to being on the river. There are people in the rafts, and everybody can sort of be in a raft, and you sort of know, hey, there are people that have never been on the river before, and they come out and they get in a raft, and they got a guide and the whole thing. And then there are canoes, and then there are the people in the kayaks, and, they look down on everybody. But anyway, so I sort of wanted to try it. So we went and got our canoe, and there are just a bunch of differences about doing a river in a raft and doing it in a canoe. For instance, when you're in a raft, water, you go down the rapid and water gets in the raft, but it's not a big deal because the raft can continue to float with water in it, and it's sort of, some of them self-bail, and it's pretty easy. In a canoe, if you get too much water in the canoe sinks, and you have to get the water out of the canoe. The other thing is, it's sort of when you're going down a river in a canoe or in a raft, when you hit a little bit of a rapid, you can balance yourself, a little bit of your weight against the side of the raft, and it'll be all right. The raft sort of pushes back a little bit, and you can gain your balance with, the oar and the side of the raft. But as we're about to put the canoe in the water, and he had sort of talked to me about this before, and then my friend just emphasized it to me again. He said, look, when we get in the rapids and you begin to lose your balance a little bit, the biggest difference you got to remember is you cannot balance yourself on the side of the canoe. Don't lean against the side of the canoe. Don't balance yourself on the canoe. And for whatever you do, don't take your hand off the oar and grab the side of the canoe, because if you grab the side of the canoe when you're going through, you're going to flip the whole canoe, and we're both going to go in the water. So we're going down this really freezing cold river, and we get through the first rapid, and everything's fine, and then we get to the next one, and right at the end, we hit a little bit of a rock. I lose my balance, and I grab the side of the canoe, and we flip the whole thing. And so we have to pull this heavy canoe over the side, dump the water out of it, and we're getting everything ready. And he says to me again, I want you to remember, don't take your hand off the oar. I said, I got it. He said, you sure you got it? I said, I got it. So for the rest of the time, that whole day, there really was just that one thing on my mind. Don't do what feels instinctual. Just don't take your hand off the oar. Now, I bring that up because we've been in this series called Fearless, where we're learning to live life without fear, to put our trust in God. And there's this thing about fear that when you're in a situation, when the phone call comes, or when somebody says, hey, I need to talk to you, or the boss says, hey, come into my office, or you sit in the doctor's office and back comes a report, in that moment, when the feeling comes over you of fear, there's an instinctual response that you have. There's something that you just sort of naturally do. When your husband or your wife says they're leaving, when your kid says whatever it is that you're afraid of your kid doing, when your friends tell you that they don't really want to be around you anymore, and you're alone again, the temptation is for all of us to do something instinctively. And in that moment of fear, the fear overwhelms us, and we do this thing by instinct. But there are a whole bunch of us that if we were honest and we'd reflect back on our life a little bit, the truth is some of our greatest regrets have come in the moment of fear, where we've reacted by our instinct, and we've done something or we've said something. In fact, some of the things, the words we wish we could take back the most, the actions that we could take back that we've done in that moment of fear, they wind up costing us more by our instinct reacting instead of doing what we ought to in the moment. It's almost the same thing of, hey, don't take your hand off the oar, but in the moment you grab the side of the canoe, and in that moment of fear, you flipped your whole boat. Your whole life got out of control. So the question I want to answer for us as we're in this fourth week of this series that I want to attempt for us to look at together is, what do I do in that very first moment of fear? What should be my first line of defense? What's the very first thing I should do when that feeling comes over and my instinct begins to kick in? What do I do when I feel that fear of rejection, when I feel like I'm being abandoned, when loneliness begins to set in on me? In that moment, when the feeling of fear is just overwhelming to me, what's the first thing I ought to do? Now, today, to get at that with you, I want to talk to you about a guy. He's probably a guy that many of you haven't heard of a lot. He has one of my favorite names in all of the Bible. In fact, I wish some of you would name your kids. You're looking for some really standout name for your kid. I love this name. He's a leader. He's got a lot to lose, and he's under tremendous pressure. And his name is Jehoshaphat. And the last part, fat, is just the way it ought to be spelled, P-H-A-T, fat. He's Jehoshaphat, and he's a leader. He's the king of the nation of Judah. Now, if you've been around here a little bit over the last few months, we've been talking about the story of redemption of God's people. You probably remember when we were talking about the kings that at one point, because of their sin and their betrayal of God, the whole nation just splits in two. There's this giant civil war, and the majority of the tribes go into one nation that remains called Israel, and then another part becomes Judah. Well, Jehoshaphat is the king over Judah, and he's a great king. He's faithful to God. He fears God. He tries to respect God in everything to do. He's trying to bring the people of Judah back to God at every step in his leadership. But he's in a situation now where I hope I can help you see that almost anybody would be afraid. He's a leader, so when you're a leader and there's something that, brings fear to the people you're leading, you're under tremendous pressure. He's in this situation. He's been a good king, but there's tremendous pressure on him to do something in this instance. And I just want you to see how he handles it, what his first reaction is to this thing. This is from a book in the older part of the Bible that sort of chronicles the life of all these kings, so it's called Chronicles. Let me begin reading to you. It says, After this, the Moabites and the Ammonites and some of the Mennonites came to make war on Jehoshaphat. Some men came and told Jehoshaphat, a vast army is coming up against you from Edom, from the other side of the sea. It's already ready at Hazazon Tamar, that is in Gedi. Alarmed, Jehoshaphat resolved to inquire of the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast for all of Judah. Now, he's a leader. So when there's something that comes up, there's a problem come up, everybody who's a leader, you sort of feel like you're supposed to have the answers. People are looking at you for what to do, and they're wanting you to instill confidence and tell them, hey, this is the way we're going to handle this, and I know it seems bad, but it's going to all be okay. But what Jehoshaphat does is he turns his attention away from the person who's giving him the bad news. He turns his mind away from the bad news, away from the person delivering the bad news. And he turns his mind in that moment toward the Lord. Now, the reason that's so remarkable to me to even point it out to you is that that's not my first reaction. In the moment when my instincts take in and something makes me afraid, there's something that I've got to do, my first instinct is not to turn my eyes to the Lord and away from my problem. Now, I'm not saying my mouth doesn't talk to the Lord. Oh, no, in the moment, my mouth starts talking to the Lord. I turn my mouth to the Lord, and I start telling him what I want him to do and how I want him to help. But my heart and my eyes are focused on what I have the problem with. In fact, what I talk to the Lord about is not my focus of the Lord. My focus is on the problem. I start telling him about the problem. My mouth starts talking to God. And I say that because it's not remarkable that Jehoshaphat prays. Everybody prays when they're afraid. You may be joining in with us and you don't even believe in God. But if the problem gets big enough, if the tension gets high enough, if you have a problem, you finally feel like I can't do anything about it, you pray, the prayer, hey, somebody, anybody, if you're out there somewhere, do something. It's not remarkable that he prays. What's remarkable is that in that moment, what's unique about Jehoshaphat is in that moment, he makes a decision to turn his heart toward the Lord. He turns his attention away from his problem in the moment, and he focuses his mind and the mind of the people onto his Father in heaven. He assembles everybody he can in the nation, and he gives a model prayer, I think, for scared people. In fact, I just say to you, if you're afraid and you're a person that when fear hits you, there's an instinct that overwhelms you and you know it and you've blown it more than a few times, you've said things, you've done things, and you realize looking back that you've messed it up, what we're going to look at in the next few moments, I think is the model prayer for frightened people. This is something that, I mean, you'll have to change the words because your situation's a little different, but you'll have to fill in the blanks a little bit. But Jehoshaphat gives a model for scared people to pray. Let me just walk this through you. It begins in verse 4. The people of Judah came together to seek help from the Lord. Indeed, they came from every town in Judah to seek him. Then Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah in Jerusalem at the temple of the Lord in front of the new courtyard and said, O Lord, God of our fathers, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nation. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. Now, I just want to say to you, I don't know about you, but that's not the kind of stuff I pray when I'm afraid. When I'm afraid, I tend to pray about what I'm afraid about. I tend to talk to God about the thing that has my instincts on alert. I tend to talk to him about the problem. You know what? Jehoshaphat starts this whole thing. He starts his prayer this way. And here's why this is so key for us to note with this whole thing. Because Jehoshaphat has made up his mind that he's going to focus himself and his people on God. He's going to talk to them and he's going to remind himself and them on the God who is able. Let me just read the next few verses for you. He begins talking to them about saying to them things like, oh God, you are the God who's in heaven, or God, are you not the one who is able? Oh God, are you not strong? God, you are large and in charge. You are God and I am not. That's what he begins praying, and he focuses everybody's attention not on the situation they are in, but the God who is very able. And that's what we need to do when we're afraid. But then he goes on and he begins to remind himself even further of what this God has already done for them. Verse 7. O our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? They have lived in it and built in it as a sanctuary for your name, saying, if calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, we will stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name, and we will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us. Now, after he begins this thing of reminding them who God is, and he reminds them that he's in charge, he begins to rehearse for them and himself what God has done for them in the past. Again, that is not my instinct in that moment. You want to know how I pray? I pray, oh God, help. Oh God, do something. Oh God, look at this. Oh God, look at them. Oh God, look at what's happening in my relationship. Oh God, look at what's happening with what I'm supposed to do. Oh God, do you know about this? No, Ed, I didn't know. Thanks for pointing that out. See, instinctively in the moment, my first instinct when I'm afraid is to get God to focus on me and focus on my problem, focus on what's going on. Oh God, look at me. Oh God, make sure you see what's happening. Oh God, focus on my fear. Jehoshaphat goes a total different way. Jehoshaphat says, no, that's not where we're going. We're going to focus on the God who is able, the God who is capable, the God who in the past has done so much for us. I'm going to remind me and everyone I lead of who this God is. And then he goes on in verse 10, and he talks about what they need. But now, here are the men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came up from Egypt. So now they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us for coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance? O God, will you not judge them? For we, and this is so great, for we have no power to face this vast army that's attacking us. And then here's my favorite part. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. Will you just say that out loud right where you are? Just say that with me. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. One more time. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. Then they stand and they focus themselves on God. And then they do the most difficult thing of all. All the men in Judah, with their wives and children and little ones, stood there before the Lord. Now, I'm a horrible waiter. I mean, how about you? I hate to wait. I'm not very patient. I'm a pretty good doer. So in the moment, what I tend to pray is I want to do something. So I'll start out and I'll say, oh God, look at what's happening. Look at what's going on. God, I need you to do something. God, I'm not capable. God, would you do something? Give me a sign. And then I pray that on Sunday, and when nothing happens by Wednesday, I'm like, okay, hold on. I'll go do something. Because there's just something in me that feels like, well, I got to do something. I mean, right or wrong, indifferent, I got to do something. I can't stand the tension of this. I got to do something. I take my hand off the oar and I do something. I make sure that something gets moving. And some of my most embarrassing, some of the mistakes I regret as a leader, some of the mistakes I regret as a father, as a husband, as a friend, some of the biggest mistakes in my life personally have come when in the moment of fear, I decided, well, you got to do something. You got to say something. You got to have something happening. And yet Jehoshaphat and his people, they don't do that. He focuses their mind. He rehearses what's going on. He talks to God about what's happening. And then they wait. They just wait. And we don't have any indication how long they wait. But they wait. God is faithful, and He speaks, and He gives them an action step. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jehaziel. I think that's how you say it. And then they give his whole family tree, which I'm not going to try to read to you. They talked to him, and then he said, listen, King Jehoshaphat, and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem, this is what the Lord says to you. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. Look at this. For the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow, march down against them. They'll be climbing up by the pass of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the gorge in the desert of Jeruel. You will not have to fight this battle. Take up your position, stand firm, and see the deliverance of the Lord will give you. O Judah and Jerusalem, look at this. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out and face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. And then I love this. Jehoshaphat bowed his face to the ground, and all the people in Judah and Jerusalem fell down in worship before the Lord. And nothing had changed. They turned and they worshiped God, and the army is still surrounding them. The army is still coming. The message of doom is still there. They are still under attack. They worshiped and they fell down before anything had happened. Before they did what they were commanded to do, before they knew what was going to happen, in that moment, they bowed down and they worshiped. Verse 20. Early in the morning, they left for the desert of Tekoa. As they set out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, listen to me, Judah and people of Jerusalem. And now he's going to give them the leader's speech, the brave hard talk, the coach talk. He's going to get them, the troops rallied. He says, have faith in the Lord your God, and you'll be upheld. Have faith in His prophets, and you will be successful. After consulting the people, Jehoshaphat appointed men to sing to the Lord and praise Him for the splendor of His holiness as they went out in the head of the army, saying, give thanks to the Lord, for His love endures forever. And eventually, they see the deliverance of God. It happens just the way God said. So what I want to do for you this morning is I want to give you three words that I want to sort of, in my analogy, give you the don't take your hand off the oar kind of words. I want to give you words that have become the first line of defense when your instincts kick in and you're just so afraid. And by that I mean, when you get the phone call, when you're sitting in the doctor's office and he's looking at the test results, when you're sitting with your spouse and you can see it's not right, when everything in you kicks in and you fear that you've been betrayed, you fear that you've been lied to, you fear that you're going to be alone, when fear kicks in and your instincts are to take your hand off the oar and grab the canoe and turn the whole thing over. In that moment, there are three words I want to give you, just three words that I want us to think about that become our first line of defense against that feeling of fear. The first word is the word worship. You know why worship is the first thing that we do? Do you know what worship does for you? And by worship, I want to be clear, because in our culture, particularly in churches, we've connected the word worship and singing, and so worship and singing seem to be interchanged for us. And by no means do I want to discount the power of singing. What songwriters do, they benefit us by writing so well about God's attributes and remind us of how great He is, but worship is not just singing. By worship, what I mean is it's a conscious turning of my heart to God, and if singing helps you do that, that's great. Whatever it consciously takes for you to turn your heart toward God in the moment of instinct, you turn your heart toward God, and you remind yourself who your God is. I used to have this little habit that I would go through. I still do it at times, where I would go through the ABCs and remind myself. I'd just go through and I would talk to God about who He was, and I'd say, you're so able, and you're so brave, and you're so capable. You're benevolent to me. God, you're a God that is with me, and you desire me. I'd go through every letter of the alphabet, and X is a little bit of a challenge, but I'd remind myself in worship of who God was, not what was going on in my life. You know why you do that? Why worship is the first thing you do? Because in worship, what happens is worship takes the circumstances that caused me to fear, and it puts it in the right context in my life. When I begin to focus on the power of God, the God who is able, the God who is capable, the God who has designed me to live in accordance with His will, when I put my fear in that, in light of His promises, His love begins to put me in the right context. And the right context for my fear is, there's a Father who loves me. There's a God who gave His life for me. There's a Father who said He would never leave me, that He would never forsake me. When I worship, I reorient my life and my circumstances around a Father who loves to give good gifts to His children. And instead of orienting the moment of my life around my fear and those circumstances and what's happened in my life. When we do that, when I begin to worship in the moment of my fear, here's what happens. Over time as I worship, over time as I rehearse how God has been with me, over time as I remind myself of my presence, of God's promises to me and His presence that is with me, and over time as I think about His faithfulness, my fear begins to fade, and your fear will get put in the right place in your life, and your mind will stand on His goodness and His greatness and His power. And you know what you experience in that moment? Even though the circumstances of your fear have not gone away, you know what you begin to experience when you worship? Peace. You experience His peace. Over my time in being in ministry, I've walked with people through everything imaginable. Over the last 25 years in this church, I've walked with people through abuse, rape, loss of children, disease, adultery, you name it. I've walked with people through it, and I've only seen really two reactions. There's the reaction of people in the moment, and the feelings overwhelm them, and their instincts take over, and they do things that begin to literally turn their lives upside down because the feelings are so overwhelming to them, and they have things that later they regret. Their fear begins to write checks that later they're going to have to pay that cost them so much. Or I've watched people who in those moments, they have this incredible peace. No, they're not happy. I mean, be clear. I'm not saying they're happy. I'm not saying they're glad about what's going on. I'm just saying even before things change, there are people that have this incredible peace because they're focused on the God who is in charge and who is able. In that moment when your instinct's in, I'm telling you, when you take your fear and you put it in the right context of a Father who loves you, you take your insecurities and you put it in light of a God who gave His life for you. When you take everything that you feel and you put it in place of who God is, His greatness begins to overwhelm you. And the gift that He gives you, it begins to breathe peace into your life. And what it does is, it keeps you from doing stupid things. You keep your hand on the oar and you don't turn over the canoe. When you worship, you don't think, I got to go solve something. It keeps you from saying a bunch of stuff that later you'll regret, because the proper context of our fear is the goodness and the greatness and the power of God. And Jehoshaphat saw it so clearly as the very first line of defense, and he led the people to do it. He dropped to his knees, and he began to worship. He not pray. Everybody prays when they're afraid. He didn't pray. He began to worship. So the first thing we do is we worship. Got it? Second, we wait. And this is a tough one. I'm telling you. I'm not advocating irresponsibility. What I'm saying is that when I'm afraid, again, generally, I get ideas and they're inappropriate, and I begin to catastrophize. And generally, I think about things that I need to do that'll solve this problem. I think it'll solve it, and inevitably, often the solutions are just inappropriate. And our challenge is that once I'm worshiping and once my mind is focused on God, and I start getting this feeling and sense of peace from God in my life, that it could be okay, even though nothing's happened, I still have to remind myself that God is in charge and I need to wait. Now, I just say to you, this is the most difficult part for me. This is very, very difficult for me. I'm an activistic kind of person. I'm a doer by nature, and my whole life long, if there's a challenge, I've wanted to face it head on. I've wanted to almost run at it. Whether it was in my family, it was in relationships, whether it was me personally, whether this is church, I'm responsible, and I wanted people to know that I was taking some action. And I think to myself, people need to see me doing something. When you're afraid, there's this instinctual reaction. I'll just say for some of you, your instinct is to go completely passive. And that's not what I'm talking about either. I'm talking about you're waiting. You're waiting for God to move, not just to solve it, but to God give you an indication that there's something He wants you to do. Instead of you reaching out, you drop the oar and you grab the canoe and you flip your whole life. So I worship, and then I wait, and then finally, the third word is do. So worship, wait, and do. Eventually, there's going to be something that God's going to ask me to do. I need to do something. There is going to be some action that I'm going to need to take. But I just want to warn you. It's been my experience that almost always when God really is in it, that God will almost always ask me to do things that seem a little bit unusual to me, like, picking out some men to send in front to sing instead of the army. He sends the choir first to go out and sing praise to God and to worship instead of, hey, let's go fight, and we're just going to stand and wait. Maybe something like, hey, when everything in me wants to hold on and fight, God just says, hey, why don't you just let go? When your fear of falling and who's going to catch you, God may just say to you, hey, jump. Just jump. When you're pulling on the tug rope in a relationship, and God may just say to you, hey, you just need to tell her, hey, it's okay if you go. I don't want you to go, but it's okay. It's almost always, to me, that in those moments when God is in it, when I have worshiped and eyes wait, that almost always God asks me to do something unusual, so that in the end, I will know God was the one that did something. Because remember this, your fear, my fear, we learned this a few weeks ago. My fear is God's greatest opportunity. But only if I allow my trust in God, my fear of God, to outweigh my fear. When I keep things in perspective and I put God on His throne and I remember that He is large and in charge, when He gives me something to do, it'll often be something counterintuitive. It's almost never, hey, hold on to the side of the boat and that's what you need to do. See, my fear is God's greatest opportunity. Your fear is God's greatest opportunity. But He'll often call you to do something unusual in the midst of your fear and following. Not irresponsible things, just unusual things. All I'm saying is you need to be ready. Would you right now look around on the chair next to you and look for your connection card? Maybe you've already put your name and you've given us information of how we can contact you. We'd love for everybody to just take a moment, put your name, email address, and any information you want us to have on there so we can contact you, maybe a number where we can text you. But on the back of it really is what I want to focus you on now. Would you turn to the part in the back that says, today my next step is? Many of us in this series, over the last several weeks, we've begun to identify the primary fear in our life that currently is holding us back from following God, from being the person that God wants us to be. You're afraid of failure, or you're afraid of betrayal, or you're afraid of being alone, or whatever it is, and you've named it. I mean, there are people here that you're afraid of being left out, so it causes you to do things that your peers want to do, but you know you're compromising, and you're not proud of the person that you are, and you're just afraid. And some of you have finally come to the conclusion, I don't want my life to be driven by fear anymore. I want to live fearless before God. The only fear I want to control my life is my fear and respect of the God who loves me. So maybe for some of you today, your next step is to say, I'll name the fear. I will name the fear. I will tell someone else the fear that's been controlling my life. I will name my fear. And then your next step would be to say, after I name the fear, I will not any longer. It's time for you to say, after I name the fear, I'll take the step and I'll say, I'll spend time this week focusing on God who is able, focusing on who He is in my life and how great He is, not asking God to focus on my fear. So much of our fear drives us to ask God to focus on what I'm afraid of. This week, your next step could be, this week, God, I'm going to focus on You. I'm going to worship You. Maybe you've only been around here a little bit, and the only honest next step you could take is to say, I'll take the step that I'll continue to come and learn. I'll figure out if I can trust God. I hope all of you are going to be with us next week, that you'll come back and join us, and I hope many of you will step past your fear and you'll invite somebody to come with you on Water Day as we allow God to use us to make a difference in our family and friends' life as we learn to live a fearless life. If you'll bow now, I'll pray with you. God, You are God who loves us from the very beginning of time. You've had us in mind. In fact, the whole creation came about for us so that we could be with You. And God, we're thankful for the way that You've guided our lives and brought us to this point, that had us join in on this today. God, You are capable to do everything that needs to be done. You are fully able. You are the God who sits above in heaven and controls the earth. And God, there are people here today that for the first time are trying to reach out and trust You. I pray that You'll give them a sense that You are with them. Help us this week to remind ourselves who You are and what You've done and what You're capable of doing in our lives, and to trust You. Thank You for Jesus. He's the final, greatest example of how much You care about us, how much You are for us, and how You're with us. Thank You for Him, the Holy Spirit that walk with us in every situation. It's in His name that I pray now. Amen.